All right, we're in Matthew 25, and I believe we're concluding our parable study in here. So next Sunday starts our meeting with Mark, and then the week after that, the next class will begin in the auditorium. We'll rotate classes. So hopefully you've done some reading here in Matthew 25. We're going to be looking at verses 1 through 13 and the parable of the 10 maidens or the 10 virgins. Let's just read the parable first, and we'll start asking some questions. Can I get someone to read verses 1 through 13? Yeah. Thank you very much. Okay, let's do two things before we start talking through the details of the parable. Let's talk about the contextual setting, and then let's talk about Jewish weddings to see if we can kind of understand what's going on here. So contextually, what's going on in these couple of chapters in Matthew? And it's an open book test. Feel free to flip back and forth in your Bible. Yeah, so in 24, especially at the beginning of the chapter, this is actually the fifth discourse of Jesus in the book of Matthew. He sees the temple, says one stone is not going to be left upon another, and that sparks a whole conversation with his disciples about what are you talking about? When are you coming back, and what will that look like? So you have that discussion, and then it leads into several stories/parables. And what is the common thread through those parables? It kind of begins at the end of 24. Okay, so there's this idea of entering into judgment. Yeah, there's this unexpected, like you're going about daily life and then all of a sudden something happens. There's a turn, or Jesus shows up, and we have that here in this parable where there's this unexpected, they're anticipating the arrival of the bridegroom, but they don't know the exact time, and then boom, he's there, right? So I think that unexpected element is what weaves through these stories, right? Any other connections between these couple of chapters that you see? Maybe let's add on to this. Since there's this unexpected nature of when something is going to happen, what's the application in most of these? Be prepared. There's this repeated phrase in most of these parables. Let's see. The idea, verse 13, 25:13. Watch, therefore. Okay? Be looking, be anticipating, be mindful. You know something's about to happen. The time frame is just the unknown. So get ready for that. All right? So there's an unexpected thing coming. Since that's the case, do what you can to be ready. Seems to be another common theme through those. Anything else that you see as a theme through those stories? Yeah. So there were some that were ready and some that weren't. So you've got, especially in this parable, you've got the 10, 50% are ready, 50% are not. Although we're going to talk about some comparisons and contrasts between the two groups, because it starts off with a lot of similarities. And there might be a lot of application for us in this room at the end of it. Great point. Okay, let's talk about Jewish weddings for a second. Let's talk about historically. What do you all know about first century Jewish weddings? Thank you. Nothing. You all might know a little bit more than you realize. Okay, let's go back to the beginning of Matthew. We're introduced to Jesus' parents. And what do we know about their relationship at the very beginning? Are they married? Yeah, they're betrothed. The word that your Bible will use is they're betrothed. And so for our sakes and purposes, it's like a step in between engagement and marriage. Like, you would get engaged, but legally, you were just about married. I mean, to get unbetrothed required a certificate of divorce. Okay? So Joseph and Mary are betrothed. There's this betrothal period. This is just a little detail that I didn't know. The wedding would take place either on a Wednesday or a Thursday. If she had never been married before, you got married on a Wednesday. If she was a widow, you got married on a Thursday. So depending on the day of the week, told you something about her marital status. That was news to me. Usually, the bridegroom and his party would make their way to the home of the bride or some other location where they would meet up, okay? And they would come together for the ceremony. After the ceremony, there would be a procession, usually to the home of the bridegroom, where they would feast, sometimes for days, to celebrate the wedding. Okay? Usually, the procession would take place at night. And if it takes place at night, what are you going to need to walk through town? Yeah. Okay. And it seems like this is the procession of the parable. So think about it like this. Usually here, when we have a wedding ceremony, everyone is gathered together, whether it's in somebody's yard or in a big building, and the ceremony takes place. And then before they leave that location, when they go to leave for their honeymoon, what do we do to send them off? Yeah, so when I was a kid, you'd line both sides and pitch rice at them. That's not cool anymore. We don't throw rice. Now we blow bubbles. Now we do sparklers. Now we do, there's some kind of thing where you have people on either side creating a passageway or a gauntlet for them to go through to get to their vehicle and leave. Okay? And it's a way to honor them. Everyone's paying attention to them. They're taking off and starting their new life together. Right? During this procession in Matthew 25, these maidens would have been waiting for the bridegroom to show up, and they're all going to be holding lamps that are supposed to be really bright. And they're going to illuminate the way and illuminate the bride and the bridegroom. What kind of lamp do you think that they had? Just looking at the details in the parable, I want you to try to visualize what this looked like. Okay, so most of us, when we hear that word, we think of the little clay oil lamp that it almost looks like a little baby pitcher, right? Where it has a spout, and then it has a central point where you could put oil in the top, but the spout has a wick, and you would light the wick and keep pulling that wick out as it burned, and you could keep fueling the lamp with oil. But think about this. How much light is that little oil lamp going to carry in public in an alley? Like when we think of lamps, we think about that. There's another possibility, another light source. When Jesus was arrested at the Garden of Gethsemane, what did the crowds come to him with across the valley? Torches. Okay. And so the way that would work is you would have a large object or a stick or something, and then you would have cloth that was wrapped around it, and it had been soaking in oil, and you would use it soaked in oil, but if you wanted it to burn really bright, when you first lit it, you would douse it with more oil on top to make it go brighter. Does that make sense? And so some people have suggested that maybe what's being described here is it's a bigger light source, and they're wanting it to go even brighter because it's probably been soaked on the way, but they're trying to get it ready to get really bright when the bridegroom shows up. That's possible. I'm not going to die on that hill. I'm okay with either idea, but it seems to make sense to me with a bridal procession that's going out in a public street that, especially with a wedding ceremony, you're going to get really, really bright light. That's going to cast light in a lot of different directions as you go. And in both cases, whether it was the torch idea that needs fresh oil to get really bright, or it's the little clay light source that's going to need fed and fed and fed and fed as you go, either way, you need fresh oil and more oil than what you brought with you. Questions, comments, how do you picture that? What do you think about that? No pushback whatsoever, okay. No one has a strong opinion. Is it helpful to picture the wedding procession to kind of get what's going on here? Does that make sense to you that they're celebrating and trying to get him to his multi-day party? Before we look at more detail here, can you think of any other stories or any other parables in the Gospels that use the idea of a wedding? Okay, there is the water to wine, so they're at the feast, right? So they're at the feast. They've already had the procession. What else? Was there ever an invitation to a wedding feast? How did those parables go? Okay, there were all these invitations sent out, and the best friends and the elite kept making excuses for why they couldn't come. And so what did they end up doing? Who did they end up inviting? Everybody. Everybody can come to the feast. So everybody shows up, except there's a problem with one guy. What's the problem? He's not dressed right. Okay. So he's not allowed to stay in there. Okay. There's another parable where an invitation is sent out, but they didn't come in time. And so you get this idea that once the feast starts, in the purpose of these parables, once the feast starts and the doors are shut, once the feast starts, if you're not ready, like, it's open to all, but there are expectations when you come. And in the sense of this one, there's a timing element. If you're not a part of the procession when the door's shut, they're not going to open back up. And we'll talk about that when we get to it. Okay, let me ask some questions as we look at details here. Starting in verse 1, this is what the kingdom of heaven is like. It's like these 10 virgins who took their lamps and went to meet the bridegroom. My footnote even says torches there. And then they're split into two groups. 5 of them were foolish, 5 of them were wise. Because when the foolish took their lamps, what did they not take with them? Okay. But the wise took flasks of oil. They had containers of fuel with them. As the bridegroom was delayed, they all became drowsy and slept. And then what's the common element through these parables of these chapters? There's that unexpected, like you don't know when, but then boom, and then the whole thing shifts. Right? And so we've got that in verse 6. At midnight, some of your versions will just say sometime in the middle of the night, there was a cry, "Here's the bridegroom. Come out to meet him." Verse 7, all those virgins rose and trimmed their lamps. Okay, so let's stop there. Up till now, what do the wise and the foolish have in common? They've got what? Separation? I think I know what you're saying. Yeah. So at the end, there's going to be separation for sure. So here in these first 7 verses, what's the same between the two groups? Okay, they all have the same goal. Okay, they all have lamps. I'm sorry? They did all go to sleep. The problem wasn't that they went to sleep. They all went to sleep. They all what? Yeah, they had all been invited. Right? So they'd all received the same invitation. They'd all responded to the invitation. You guys are coming up with some great similarities. Yeah. Okay. They all thought they were ready. Some of them were wrong, but they all thought they were ready. Okay. One of the resources that I looked at made an interesting point. I think it's an assumption. They all had some degree of affection and love for the bridegroom or the bride, or else they wouldn't have shown up. Anything else? It's a good round number. That's a great question. I don't think so. I think it just gave them a nice round. Here's 5 and 5. How did they all respond when they heard he's coming? They all jump up. Like they all wake up and they all start getting ready. So lots of similarities. Like up until this point, you would think they were the same. There's one little difference mentioned. What's the one little difference? Okay, so the wise had a little flask, the foolish didn't. That's the only difference between the two up to this point. What do you think about all that so far? Yeah. Okay. So the comment that was just made is, I don't think any of them expected, I'll say the 5 foolish. I don't think they expected the bridegroom to take that long. They thought he'd show up sooner. I mean, that's just foolish. I mean, he had every right to take as long as he wanted. It was a wedding, right? But they assumed he'd get there sooner. They weren't as prepared to wait that long. Before we go off of this, it just made me think of another passage. So over in Thessalonians, one of the things that some of the Thessalonians are being rebuked for is for being lazy because they think Jesus is going to come back any day. So they're not working, they're not saving up their money, like they're just living off of other people because they're like, why should I? Jesus is going to come back. And Paul has to tell those Christians, you all get back to work. Like, Jesus will come, but we don't know when. And so until he does, you've got to go back to work. So that might be a similarity. Anything else in those first 7 verses? Okay, so that's a great question. She's asking, if you're going to go to sleep, why not turn the lamp off? My guess is the lamps were out. So this is the way those lamps would have worked. Whether they were the wicks or the torches, they probably would have snuffed the wicks, and they would have not lit the torches, or they would have let the torches go down. Either way, there wasn't enough oil. If it was a lamp, there wasn't enough oil to get from where they were to where the procession was going or they didn't have enough to make the torches bright enough, long enough. Either way, they just had not prepared for that long of a wait. That's a great question. Anybody else? So verse 8, they wake up, they start getting their light sources ready, and the foolish said to the wise, give us some of your oil, for our lamps are going out. Like we're trying to get them going and to do their thing, and it's not happening. What do you think about that request? I was going to say, my kids, I can hear them in the back seat. Share, they won't share. There are some situations where it's right to share. This is not one of them. Like, I don't want to give away some of the application before we get to the end. But you need to have that in the back of your mind. Like, the 5 wise, I would say, could not share. They could not share with the other 5. Because look at what they say in verse 9. Since there will not be enough for us and for you, go rather to the dealers and buy for yourselves. Like, there just is not enough to go around for all of us to get the job done. So we've got what we need. The answer is for you all to go find another source of oil. There's a problem with that. What's the problem with that? It's the middle of the night. Like, depending on what part of town you live in, especially further out where we are, like everything closes at 8. Like, unless you're willing to drive for forever, things close at 8. So you need what you need before 8. Or else you're going to wait until tomorrow when the store is open. So they've got to scramble down to the market and try to see if someone will open their door and sell them something. Okay? What's the problem with that? Think through some of the application there for a second. Okay, the word is foolish. What do they do with that advice? Okay, they follow it, right? Verse 10, while they were going to buy, that's when the bridegroom shows up. Okay? Someone worded it this way for me a long time ago, and it really stuck with me, and I'll try to do this justice. Put your bookmark here in Matthew 25, and let's go over to Proverbs 1. And this concept of wise and foolish is really appropriate for Proverbs. So we're going to march pretty quickly through Proverbs 1 to get to the end of the chapter, because I think it ties in with the point that we're seeing here. So Proverbs 1, Solomon is setting up the whole book, emphasizing the wisdom or the value of wisdom in the first 7 verses. And by wisdom, he means, verse 7, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. So wisdom starts with the fear of the Lord. Okay? If you're foolish, you don't fear the Lord. And he sets up that whole contrast. And then in verse 8, who does he start writing to? His son. And what does he tell his son in those first few verses? What is he trying to say? Okay, listen. Listen to me. Listen to your mom. If you do, it's going to be a beautiful thing. People are going to see that and see that you're wise, see that you're prudent. And he tries to prepare him for what? Temptation that's going to come from, okay, when sinners entice you. Okay, verse 10, if sinners entice you, don't consent. You're going to have people that are going to try to get you to do bad things. Specifically, he's like, if these sinners entice you to go kill people for their money, don't go. And I used to make a crack about this. Like, I personally have never been enticed to go murder somebody. And then I taught this in a prison, and I made that joke. And one of the guys was like, that's why I'm in here. Some guys enticed me to go murder somebody, and I did it. I was like, I can't joke like that anymore. That's what he's warning him against. When you have friends that try to convince you to do dumb stuff, don't listen to them. Verses 20 through 23, it may seem like a hard shift, but it's not. It's the next step in this logic chain. Verse 20, wisdom cries aloud in the street. In the markets she raises her voice. At the head of the noisy streets she cries out. At the entrance of the city gates she speaks. Let's stop. Who is he talking about here? Wisdom described as what? As a woman. Okay? Wisdom is personified as a woman standing in the most public place in town saying, listen to me, listen to me, listen to me. Okay. Verse 22, and this is what she says. How long, O simple ones, will you love being simple? How long will scoffers delight in their scoffing and fools hate knowledge? If you, what? Starts with a T. Turn. If you turn at my reproof, behold, I will pour out my spirit to you. I'll make my words known to you. What do we call it if someone is going away from the Lord, they're sinning, and someone warns them and they turn and come back? What is that turn called? Repentance. Okay? That turn is called repentance. So Solomon, he's like, son, listen to me. Don't give in to peer pressure. But when you do and wisdom warns you, turn. But we're not done. Verse 24. Because, this is still wisdom talking, because I have called and you refuse to listen. I've stretched out my hand, no one heeded. Because you ignored all my counsel, you'd have none of my reproof. I will laugh at your calamity. I will mock when terror strikes you. When terror strikes you like a storm and your calamity comes like a whirlwind, when distress and anguish come upon you, they will call upon me, but I will not answer. They will seek me diligently, but will not find me. Wisdom sounds kind of like a jerk. What is she saying here? Yeah, that's a great way to say it. Some of the benefits of wisdom are a limited time offer. There will come a point that you may turn, and if you turn, will you be right in your relationship with God? Yes. Like, you can repent and come back to the Lord at any point in your life. But as far as the practical benefits of wisdom, some of those practical benefits have a limited time offer. So, for example, my buddies in the prison. There was a baptistry in the chapel. I lost count of the guys that I baptized over 4 or 5 years in the prison. Did becoming a Christian ever get them out of jail early? Never. Did becoming a Christian erase their permanent record? Did becoming a Christian take away some of the physical effects of being in bar fights and doing drugs and all the others? Limited time offer. Like, you get one body. You get one body. You get one shot at some of that stuff. But were they right with the Lord? Yes. Okay. So think about that and go back to Matthew 25 and these 10 virgins, where the 5 wise ones are like, hey, we don't have enough for you. The place to get this is by going to a vendor. So go to a vendor. But it's the middle of the night, and no one's selling, and it's hard to get. And even though they were like, you're right, I need to take care of this myself, and they go, it's too late. Does that make sense? What warning can we take from that? Like, we haven't even reached the end of the parable, but what warning can we take from that? Okay, be prepared. Sure. Yeah, there's always justice, for sure. Yeah. Yeah, and there is no such thing as a consequence-free choice. I mean, that's a part of becoming an adult, right? 16, 17, 18, freedom, 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 I want freedom. Great, you have the freedom to choose, but there's no such thing as a consequence-free choice. You could choose. Go ahead. Ah, But the whole point of all of this, these parables, is Jesus is going to be delayed. Like he's telling you up front, it's going to take longer than you think. He says he's coming, but what's the unknown part of that? We don't know when. Like he's given us everything that we need to pass this test. We don't know when, so how should we live? As if it could be any minute, but it could take longer. Yeah, Harry? Yes. Yes. That's a great way to say it. I love going out and doing stuff with my father-in-law because he's a Boy Scout and he's an Eagle Scout. Always be prepared. Like he's got extra tools and he's got extra rope and he's got all kinds of stuff in the back of his vehicle. Like it's almost like he has a perverse pleasure. He wants to break down. Like he wants something to go wrong because he's ready for it. Right? Now there's some point where you become a prepper. I'm not talking about that. But if we already know Jesus is coming back, but we don't know exactly when, so we need to get ready for that. We need to be living like it could be any minute, but it might not happen in our lifetime. Either way, we need to plan for both extremes. And that's called being wise. And we also need to realize, if I play this gamble of, well, I don't know when it's going to be, so I'm just going to do what I want for as long as I want. That's Proverbs 1. You could choose that. You could choose that. But then you might not be ready because you're going to get caught off guard. And there's not going to be an occasion for you to go back and make it right. Let's keep going. So while they were going to buy, like in the moment, they're like, you're right, we need to take responsibility. And they leave. They're off looking for more oil. Who shows up? The bridegroom shows up. And then what the text emphasizes is those who were ready. The ones who were prepared, the ones whose lamps were burning bright, they went in with him to the marriage feast, and the door was shut. And then obviously the other maidens, the other virgins, knew where the party was because they come to the party. Like they hadn't done their job. They were supposed to help be the celebrating procession to the thing. They missed out on all of that. They just tried to get to the party, and they're knocking on the door, and what are they saying? Lord, Lord, like they're pleading, open to us. And what does he answer? I don't know you. That seems really harsh. I don't know you. Are there some other places where Jesus uses that language? There's one in particular in my brain. Matthew 7. Yeah. So at the end of the Sermon on the Mount. Yeah. Let's flip back there. Because I think it's really similar. Maybe about verses 21 through 23. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord. Does that sound really similar? That pleading? Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. On that day, many will say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name and do many mighty works in your name? And then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. What's Jesus teaching there? What did those people in Matthew 7 think about their relationship to Jesus? They thought they had one. I mean, what was their reasoning as they tried to talk this through with Jesus? Look, we've been super busy. We've been really active. And there are some really good things that we did, and we did them out of a profession of following you. And then what does Jesus explain to them? Okay, just because you think you're following me doesn't mean you're following me. What's the test in that little series of verses? How do I know if I'm following Jesus? If it matches up with what he says. I can't just do whatever I want and put Jesus' name on it and have it be okay. I've got to go and look and see, does Jesus give me the authority or the instruction to do this or not? That's how I know if I'm going to please Jesus. And there are going to be a lot of disappointed people when Jesus returns who think that they're right with him and they're not. And he's going to have to explain to them, look, I never knew you. You were not really following me. And it is going to be a huge disappointment to all of those people. What's going on here with these 5 virgins? Knocking on the door. Let us in, let us in. And he says, never knew you. And he doesn't mean literally, I don't know who you are. I have amnesia. That's not what he's saying. He's saying, you're not a part of me. You weren't ready. The lamps weren't there. You didn't get to the door before the door was shut. Like, there's some aspects of my relationship with Jesus that, like Shani said, it's a limited time offer. What's the amount of time with Jesus? How long do I have to make that right with him? As long as I'm drawing breath, I can make my relationship with the Lord right. Okay? And Jesus teaches that throughout the Gospels too. Yeah. Yes. Yep. Yes. Yes. I'm so glad you went there because that's where my brain was going too. Like, we can be in any given congregation and just to be thinking about yourself. Do not look up and down the pew. Just be evaluating yourself. In any given group, there are people that claim to be followers of Jesus, and they have every confidence that they are, but they're not. And on the outside, it may look like it, where they're like, hey, I'm doing this and this and that, and look at how busy I am for Jesus. Your busyness is not the litmus test. Are you doing what Jesus says to do? And are you humbly doing that? And are you prepared for this unknown return? Are you prepared for that? And that's something that all of us need to think about with ourselves. You know, which of these 2 groups am I? Would I be categorized with the 5 foolish ones that weren't prepared but thought I knew Jesus? Or would I be categorized with the ones that were prepared and they were able to celebrate when he came in? And that's what each of us should be asking at the end of the parable. Yeah, Darren? No, go ahead. Okay. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. And there are a couple of points someone made, like 3 more lessons. I think that's the primary point. I need to figure out, am I ready? Am I prepared for the Lord to come back for this unexpected, unknown thing? That's the point of the parable. That's the flow of the chapters. Someone shared 3 more lessons. I think we've touched on a couple. The first is this, that my relationship with the bridegroom is not transferable. I like how that's worded. Where the 5 wise ones were like, I'm sorry, I can't give this to you. My relationship with Jesus is my relationship with Jesus. And no one else is going to get into the wedding feast by their connection to me. They need to have their own connection with Jesus. I can't give that. I think that's one of the reasons that the wise virgins couldn't give their oil away. They can't give that. That's between the Lord and each individual, right? Yeah, go ahead, Phil. Yeah, that's right. That's right. That's exactly right. Where it's like at some point, wisdom's crying and crying and crying, and you've ignored until the expiration date, and then you turn around and wisdom's like, I'm sorry. There's like nothing I can do. Um, and I'm always thinking parenting stuff right now, just because I'm in the trenches with my youngest three. We want to teach those lessons young, right? So when you give deadlines for things with your kids or with your classes or whatever, we need grace and mercy. We need to balance this out. But there also needs to be accountability. Hey, if I gave you a deadline and it passed, it passed. If that means your grade goes down, your grade goes down. If it means you miss out on a privilege, you miss out on a privilege. Like, we want to teach them responsibility with that. And again, balance with grace and mercy. But we want to help them understand some of these things are limited time offers. We've already talked about this. Some lost opportunities cannot be regained. That's what we've been saying. The third lesson, the Lord always comes without warning. We know he's coming. We just don't know when. So be ready for that. Is that our second or our third? First. Our second or our third. Our first or our second? Let me open it up. Any questions or comments about the class in general? Because this has been a fun quarter, or about this specific parable. Yeah. Great example. Great example. Going back to Genesis 6, 7, and 8, thinking about Noah's Ark. When that door shut, you weren't getting on. Like that. There was a limited period of time where you could have benefited from Noah's preaching. They did over 100 years. Right. That was great. Yeah. Mm, yeah. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Yeah, with Jesus' teaching, and especially in these parables of judgment, there's a sense of urgency. There's like, guys, you've got to get this done. You've got to get this done now. You don't know when. And so we can appreciate the mercy and the grace that he had in a lot of ways. But there was also a sense of urgency, and it's time to make a choice. You need to make a choice. Great summary of the parables overall. Anybody else? All right, I'm okay wrapping 1 or 2 minutes early before we get inundated with all the kids. So thank you for the quarter, and thank you for the class this morning and the participation. It was great, and I hope your next class next quarter goes fantastic.